This is not my typical style, and I never would have built it, but sometimes branching out is a good thing. Let's begin this project with some cherry, and while I break it down, I'm going to tell you what I'm building. My client Carol reached out asking me if I could build her an antique tea cart. And after a little chatting and some research, we settled on a rough design and a general style, which I knew was going to be a challenge to make. What I didn't know was this cart was going to cost me a lot more than just time and effort. Don't end up like me. But first, I need to finish milling so I can make the aprons, and for that, I'm going to need a template. You'll see throughout this build, I'm using a lot of templates, and for good reason. Templates help you make complex shapes consistent, which is especially important when introducing curved parts, but even more important when the ends of these aprons will become tenons, meaning they really have to be the same on all ends for the joinery to fit well. And after ripping the template to the correct width, I'm going to head over to the bandsaw to trim the excess before fine-tuning the curves with the homemade drum sander drill press attachment. But since I want this template to mirror itself on both sides, I'm going to take an extra step and use my newly sanded template to template route a scrap piece so I can transfer the upper apron curve to the opposite side of the working template. You might be thinking sanding to the line would have worked just as well, and you're right. But I'm being extra cautious to ensure the mortise and tenon joinery will fit well without having to hand fit each one individually. With the template done and the wood ripped, I can finally start working with the cherry by double-sided taping the template down and using the same operation of trimming the excess waste at the bandsaw and template routing the rest to make 4 identical aprons. And you might have noticed the aprons were a bit long, so now it's time to trim them to final size using the template to set up the miter saw. By lining up the curves, I can cut each end at the same length before rounding all the edges so I can move on to the legs. For the leg joinery, I'm going to use a router with a bushing guide to cut the mortises. But a bushing guide adds a little complexity to the process. There's a space between the bit and the outside of the bushing which needs to be accounted for in the template. So I'm finding a spacer to use with the workpiece to create the mortise jig. Sure, it's a little bit more work to use a bushing guide over a bearing guided bit, but this bit will leave the correct radius in the corners of the mortise so that the rounded aprons will fit just right. And you also might be wondering why I'm not cutting these mortises by hand, or why I'm using a jig at all and not just an edge guide. And it's because, in my experience doing this quite a few times, this is the easiest method to make mortises. And it's the easiest way to make them consistent so that they're all exactly the same, they all line up in the right spot. It's a little bit more work to do the setup, but it takes away all the thinking and measuring along the way, and those are two things I'm definitely prone to messing up. And speaking of consistency, a jig like this tends to trap chips down in the mortise, which causes the router to be pushed away from the jig wall, requiring a clean out and a second pass to finish it all up. With the structure coming together, I'm going to move on to the hardest part of this project, the wheels. One of the requests my client Carol had for this cart was to have 2 large wooden wheels, and I really wanted to convince her not to go that route, but rather than doing that, I first asked her what the significance behind these wheels were. And Carol told me when she was a young girl, she used to go visit her grandparents, and as grandparents often do, when they have special guests like grandchildren coming over to their house, they would make an occasion out of it. And one way Carol's grandmother made the visit special was by bringing out her tea cart, filled with treats and goodies for all ages. And one of the defining characteristics that Carol remembers is the 2 large wooden wheels on this tea cart. And I'll be the first one to admit that I was intimidated by those wheels. I spent many sleepless nights building them over and over in my head because I knew I had to recreate Carol's grandmother's cart, and these wheels will be well worth the struggle to make that happen. So the first step you already saw was to cut all the outside parts at the miter saw using a stop block to make sure that they're all exactly the same length. And then the second part, which I'm working on now, is to cut the hubs consistently. And there are 2 consistent cuts I need to make. One is to turn these blocks into perfect squares, and the second is to take those squares and turn them into perfect octagons. And that way the faces can be drilled and in line exactly with the outside of the wheel parts. And you'll see how that all comes together in a second. And this is the way that I figured out how to make this all work. And I did it by simplifying each step and understanding what parts I need, how to make each one, and how they will work together to make the wheel work. You'll see these wheels are really only 3 parts, but the order in which each of those parts are cut and then glued together matters more than the actual pieces themselves. So with the octagons all cut, it's time to center drill each of the faces. And since it's the same process for the rest of the outside wheel parts, let's move on to making the dowels. Now for this build, I'm actually going to use 3 different sized dowels. The first one that I'm making now is for the axle, so it's a little bit bigger, but I didn't have the right router bit to correspond with my drill bit like I do for the smaller ones. So what I'm going to do is drill a partial hole with a little bit of it exposing at the drill press, and then attach a chisel here, and then trim the dowel to be the exact perfect size of that hole. Then I'll label that Forstner bit and keep that for later so I can drill out the hubs and the axle, and everything will fit just right. But for now, let's trim and hand fit the spokes. At this point, the order of operations becomes very important. I can't glue this whole thing together, otherwise the hub and the inner part of the wheels will still be octagons. But I can't round each piece individually, so I decided to glue up each half of the wheel, and while that glue dries, let's go over and make some templates. With the templates all done and the glue dried on the wheel halves, you can see how I can separate them and then temporarily secure them back together using some double-sided tape so that I can take them over using those templates to make the insides of the wheels round. At this point of the build, you may have noticed I used a lot of double-sided tape on this project, and you might be wondering why I didn't use the blue tape trick where you use blue tape on both of your work pieces and you put super glue in the middle. And that's because super glue, when dried, can be a little bit brittle, and it can break apart under impact. And this operation at the writer table is not a place that I want pieces or templates breaking free and flying around the shop. And if you're curious how strong the double-sided tape is, just take a look. But with the inside wheel parts all rounded, it's time to prepare for final glue up. But to do that, I'm going to need to do a little bit of cleanup first, starting with this router tear out. All right, so I cut my thumb.
And I'm considering myself lucky. I'm okay. I'm going to make a full recovery and it's not going to affect the function of my thumb. But it could have been a lot worse. And the reason why I was doing that with the chisel is because I didn't want to spend the 5 minutes it took to set up this machine here and do it with the sander in a much safer way. I knew as I was going, it was not the right way to do it. It's not like I haven't done something like that before many times and I've never had a problem, but it only takes once. Saving that couple of minutes really wasn't worth it.
Not only did I have to sacrifice a bit of flesh for this project, but I'm also going to have to sacrifice some of the design because of it. But I'll show you more of that later. For now, I'll tenderly finish sanding and assembling these wheels so I can start rounding the outside with, you guessed it, another template. And while I do more template routing, I want to bring us back to the idea I started this video with. I said that I never would have made this, and that's because it doesn't fit into my typical style. But as I was planning this project, I realized that's okay. Being typical can be boring, and woodworking is an opportunity to create new things, not the same old stuff over and over again, and this project exposed me to a whole new world of style which gives me ideas for new projects to come that will break me out of my mold. But with the axle holes drilled, the wheels are done, and it's time to move on to the focal point of the cart, the tables. And for those, I'm going to need another template. And while I go ahead and cut these tables, I want to talk a little bit about tools. A little bit ago, I made a short video where I said it's not about the tools, but about the woodworker. You and your creativity and your knowledge. That's what makes your projects happen. The tools are just a means to translate your vision into wood, and I stand by that statement. But I did receive some comments saying that that's rich coming from someone lucky enough to have all those tools in their shop, and you know what? To some degree, they're right. I do have a lot of tools, and I'm lucky in a lot of ways, but these tools didn't get here with luck. This shop has taken years to get to this point. Years of working late into the night and stealing time from my family to be out here. These tools are a product of sacrifice. But so is the knowledge and skill I've developed in each and every project. And I'm at this point where each project has a new challenge, but a new tool won't solve it. At this point, it's all about the acquisition of knowledge to progress myself as a woodworker. Which is why I'm making some courses on some woodworking topics that have helped me jump up levels and make my woodworking leaps and bounds better than it used to be. So if you're interested in doing the same and speeding up your woodworking progression, then take it from me and learn from my long nights in the shop by clicking the link down in the description, going to my website and checking out a few of the courses that I've created for you all. Now back to the project where my shortened thumb forced me to pivot away from mortise and tenons for these apron stretcher connections to using screws. It wasn't my first choice, but after some plugs, they'll look great, and you know what? A little pivoting isn't such a bad thing. And now for the final piece I have to make for this project, the handle, which I'm going to glue on now so I can round these legs over all at once, which will be much easier to do at this phase.
So now all my parts are done, but I'm not down with the thickness of these legs, which means I'm going to have to take it apart and figure out a way to fix it.
It really sucks thinking that you're finished with a project and realizing it isn't good enough, especially after you've poured literal blood, sweat, and tears into your project. And I really wanted to ignore this issue and move forward, but I'm lucky to have someone who's willing to tell me the honest truth. And it is tough to hear, but the trick to receiving criticism is to open your mind. If you ask someone to give their honest feedback, don't expect it to be positive. Expect it to be real. Open your mind, open your ears, and set those emotions aside. Your work is personal to you. It feels like it's part of you, but it really isn't. It doesn't have feelings. This wood is just wood. And it can be manipulated, changed, and fixed, and I'd rather fix it now than deliver a less than stellar project to my client. All that to say, I have to thank my wife Ashley, who's the unsung hero of all of my projects. She reviews every part and piece, every design, and every video along the way, coaching me and pointing out flaws so I can fix them and put out the best work I am capable of. So my advice, find someone you can trust to be honest with you and be open and receptive to their feedback. But speaking of this project, now it's time for me to re-glue these handles back on. Unfortunately, there was a reason why I initially did this while all the parts were nice and square, and they ended up breaking right back off. So don't worry, I'll fix it, but I'll do that later. For now, let's move on to another design element that I want to add to these tables. Since this cart is going to move, it needs a way to stop objects from sliding off the edge. So I'm adding a groove which is going to be filled with a proud walnut inlay. And I've never done anything like this before, so I did a little bit of research, and I found that I could steam these strips to get them to bend the way that I wanted to, or if I made them thin enough, I could simply soak them in some water. So I decided to do that because I didn't feel like going through the efforts to figure out the whole steam box process, and instead soak the strips in some water for 2 days to make them a little bit more flexible. And after drying them off, I was able to try to put them in place. Damn it. All right, plan B. Dish out the trays instead. And at this point in the project, I realized I had done more pivoting than sticking to my original plan. But hey, sometimes you got to know when to fold them. And at this point, routing out and sanding was the fastest way to get to the finish. As soon as Carol asked for an antique style project, I knew which finish I had to go with. This is shellac, and it's applied with rubber. No joke, that's what it's called. And the method is called French polishing, which is a process of applying and buffing the shellac to a nice shine, and in my opinion is the best looking finish. Plus, it's one of the world's oldest finishes, so yeah, perfect for an antique. And if you want to know more about this process, check out my website where I have a step-by-step course on how to do it. And while I do the rest of this assembly, I want to bring us full circle back to the idea that we started with. As a furniture designer and maker, I often find myself surrounded by sameness. Sameness in my work, sameness in my inspiration, and it's partially to do with the platforms I draw inspiration from, but mostly my own fault. I get complacent in my space, seeing the same stuff, doing the same things, and slowly iterating on past ideas. But occasionally, I need to break out of the mold. This project was a reminder to climb up and out of the rut. Look around and expose yourself to diverse ideas, even if they're old and antique, and it'll make you realize there's no limitation to your creativity. Here's a project that I never would have made. It was tough, it pushed me and broke me a little, but in the end, it made me an even better craftsman.